name and her headshot on the screen. Dr. Brittani Orona is currently a UC President's and Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Santa Cruz. In summer of 2025, she will join the Department of Native American Studies at UC Davis as an assistant professor. Her research and teaching focus on Indigenous history and human rights, environmental studies, public humanities, and visual sovereignty. Orona received her PhD in Native American Studies with a designated emphasis in human rights from University of California, Davis, an MA in Native American Studies from UC Davis, and an MA in Public History from Sacramento State University, and her BA in History from Cal Poly Humboldt. In addition to her academic work, Orona has worked for several federal, local, and state government agencies. Orona is Hupa and an enrolled member of the Hupa Valley Tribe in Northern California. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Brittani Orona.
It always takes a little bit to get these um, things set up. Let me try control. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for coming to this talk. And thank you to the California State Library for having me come back. This presentation is actually an extension of what I was talking about last year with Dr. Melinda Adams and Rose Ramirez. A panel I was really honored to be on and really enjoyed being on, and it helped me to think through some of these things that I've been now thinking about for over a year as I am developing my book project on the Klamath River Basin. So today I'd like to also recognize that I am on the unceded territory of the Nisenan and Miwok people in the Sacramento Valley, a place that I grew up around and am very familiar with as, as a person, a Native person from California. I like to honor those people who are here as well. And so today I'm going to be talking about Klamath River fish weirs toward a decolonial future. And really what I'm going to be talking about is critical infrastructure. And what critical infrastructure means to Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples, but also how settler critical infrastructure has impacted our rivers and our lives. And so I will be going through some pretty dense history that I've been going through in the archives and newspapers, and really try to paint for you this picture of Native resistance that started long before the recent dams have been taken down on the Klamath River. So if you follow the news, you know that 4 dams have been removed on the Klamath in August. And so that is really exciting and really great. And so I really want to go into some of this history of proposed dams and Native activism around proposed dams and the potential revival of these fish weirs. But to hold on a second. I really need to troubleshoot something. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So you shouldn't be seeing my presenter view.
Yeah, we're not seeing that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah.
And thank you for bearing with me as I'm getting all this Zoom stuff sorted out. But so to orient you into the Klamath River Basin, I have to introduce you to where that is at. The Klamath River originates in the headwater streams of South Central Oregon and eventually flows southwest through the Cascade Range, picking up runoff from the Shasta, Scott, Salmon, and Trinity rivers in California before flowing to the Pacific Ocean. So it hits the Pacific Ocean at Requa, a Yurok village. And this area is significant for tribes of both the upper basin, so the Klamath tribe, made up of the Yokusin, Modoc, Klamath peoples, in the arid upper lake region. And this area is also very well known for agriculture. So alfalfa farming, ranching, that kind of agricultural production, and really got its start through the Klamath Project, which provides irrigation water for approximately 210,000 acres of cropland, and had its boom in the years after World War II. So that's something just to note about that area. And the water, and other infrastructure projects that were developed were hydroelectric dams. So the 4 dams that were removed on the Klamath this year and last year were hydroelectric dams, and they were owned by originally California Oregon and Power Company, and then transferred to Warren Buffett, eventually, after several decades, transferred to Warren Buffett's Pacific Corp. So there's a long history of energy development there as well. And it flows down into the more rugged region of the lower Klamath Basin. And so the lower Klamath Basin is really where I focus my attention on my research, though there is quite a lot of history on the upper basin as well. And so on the right-hand side, well, my right-hand side, you'll see the reservation lands of the lower basin. So the Hupa Reservation, which is the largest reservation in California, it's 144 square miles. The Yurok Reservation, which is made up of, was called the Yurok Extension for a long time. And then the Karuk Reservation, which is a land trust. So the Yuroks and the Hupas have the largest land base in the area now. So tribes on the lower Klamath River Basin are the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people. We are often lumped together, especially by early anthropologists such as Alfred Kroeber, who came to our area and studied us in the years after the Northwest Indian Wars. And we're often defined as world renewal people. So our ceremonies are done to remake the world. So we have the jump dance, the white deerskin dance, brush dances, other dances to help heal the sick and remake the world. But we also are different from each other, right? So we have geographical differences, river system differences. The Yuroks are often closely associated with the Klamath River, Karuks often with the Klamath and the Salmon River. And then the Hupas, my tribe, are the Trinity River, which is the largest tributary of the Klamath. We also speak different languages, so different language families, completely different languages families from each other. There are no loan words, meaning there are no words that show up between the 3 languages as being the same. So you'd have to be pretty trilingual to live in this area prior to colonization. So there are marked differences between the tribes and how we view ourselves. But one of the things that is the same amongst us is that we are river salmon people. We depend on the Klamath River and its tributaries to provide us fish. We perform dances on the water. So the Hupa perform the boat dance, which is a dance that is literally on the water on a huge dugout boat. So you have to have enough water to stand on there to go up and down to different dance sites. And that dance is still performed. But we very much see ourselves as river ocean people. We're very deeply tied to the Klamath River and the sustenance, both physical and cultural, that it offers us. So William Bauer Jr. from the William Bauer Jr. from the Concow and Wailaki tribes of the Round Valley tribe, from Concow and Wailaki of the Round Valley tribes. I'm sorry, Willie, if you're watching this. He wrote, "All people have a creation story, a narrative that explains their origins, sense of place, and uniqueness. California Indian creation stories begin on the water. California Indians understood themselves as a people of a place. Creators made this world for a certain people and a unique people for a specific place. languages and identities reinforce the significance of place. So again, I'm just reiterating what I've kind of already said, but that the river for us as Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples is essential to our identity, that and the world around us, right? The river sustains the places that are most important to us. In the Hupa language, the Trinity River, the name which I've shown for you here, translates as a power one should pray to. So it gives you a sense of how powerful that river system really is to our lives and how necessary it is for our physical and spiritual sustenance. So the secondary word here is Hun, which means river, but it also translates back to the Trinity River. So the way that I always liken it is you see like the Sacramento River, which is kind of, I'm in the Central Valley here. So I see the Sacramento River and I think Hun, which is a word that refers to the Trinity River. So all rivers kind of refer back to that major river, the Trinity River. So it places that importance of a river in my mind because of its significance to the Trinity. It's also interesting to think about that in relation to the Sacramento River because much of the water from the Trinity River is diverted into the Sacramento River for agricultural purposes. So I wanted to thank you for bearing with me as I'm drinking and battling drinking water, battling a cold here. So reservation lands in Northwestern California, as many people might know or you might not know, treaties were not ratified here in the state of California. And so reservation lands were made by executive order in 1864. And so, but in 1855, there was a reservation that was established called the Klamath River Reservation, and it's on the left-hand side here under Yurok Indigenous Territory. And so this reservation was established to put Yurok people, to put Tolowa people, amongst others, onto this reservation line to deal with the many resistance attacks that were happening in the area during the time. So the region was colonized in around 1850. And almost as soon as settlers came into the area, there's a mass amount of violence. So miners are coming in and essentially murdering, committing violence against Native people. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of resistance to that from the Native population. And so a reservation was established and a fort, the Klamath River Reservation was established. And then a fort was established there as well called Fort Tuwir. But in 1861 and 1862, winter floods destroy that fort. And so I always kind of think of it as the land is also fighting back as well. So there are many accounts of the violences that Native people experienced in Northwest California. And there are many instances of militias and the United States military founding forts in the area as well. So you get Fort Humboldt on the coast, you get Fort Tuwir that's destroyed by a flood, and then you get Fort Gaston that's established in the heart of the Hupa Valley. So again, there's just a mass amount of violence that's occurring against Native people, but there's also Native resistance to that violence. And in 1850, when mining is established, almost as soon as mining is established, waterways are diverted. So you get diversions of major streams and rivers, and then mud and mining tailings go into the water as well. So when that happens, it ends many of the fisheries runs on the Klamath and its tributaries. So that's one of the first major environmental destruction events. In 1864, the Hupa Valley Reservation is established. And then in 1891, President Benjamin Harrison extends the Hupa Valley Reservation 1 mile each side to the Pacific Ocean. So this is what's known as the Yurok Strip. So it combines the Yurok and the Hupa reservation together. And this matters when you start thinking about, in later years, the development of different industries such as fisheries, canneries, and we'll talk about that in this presentation, but also the timber industry. So there is a period of both gold speculation, so the gold rush, what we think about the gold rush, how it was established here in the state of California. And there's a gold rush that happens on the Klamath and mainly in the Trinity rivers. So the Trinity has a major gold rush as well. But there's also dam speculation that happens. Almost like, again, I keep saying this, but almost as soon as settlers arrive into the area, there are plans to develop both mining, not both, sorry, many industries, mining, timber, fisheries, and agriculture. So you're seeing a lot of the ways in which settlers are deciding on where water will be most useful in the area. So, and it begins during the period of genocidal violence against Native people in northwestern California and in Oregon as well. So they're known as the Northwest Indian Wars, but these wars began a period of resource extraction and environmental degradation through salmon fisheries, so canneries, commercial salmon fishing, timber, and gold mining. So it changes the riverscape pretty drastically and pretty quickly as well. So R.D. Hume, who is the father of canneries in the Pacific Northwest, he notes that in 1850, there are like mass amounts of fisheries. You could walk on the backs of salmon. You'll see that narrative come out a lot. You can walk on the backs of salmon. They're so plentiful. But by 1890, those fish runs are already kind of depleting. And so the Klamath has three major fish runs. It's the fall, the spring, and the summer, with the spring being the most plentiful. So you're already seeing, with the encroachment of settler colonialism and settlers into the area, this change over the land. While Caitlin Reed describes these as rushes, explains these environmental changes as rushes akin to the California gold rush. I think it's important to also recognize the intertwined nature of individual extractive industries. So both the individual miners, and then also the corporations that come into the area. So like the Simpson Timber Company is a major one, as is the California Oregon and Power Company. So the role of corporation becomes really important on the basin. So I actually just gave a talk about canneries, so I'm really interested in them. So several canneries are established on the Klamath. So Martin Van Buren Jones is one of the first ones to establish a cannery. And then R.D. Hume, who establishes the first cannery in I think northern North America, establishes it here in the Sacramento Valley in the Sacramento River, 1864. It's a floating cannery. And then R.D. Hume establishes another one on the Klamath in 1887. And then John Baumhoff establishes a cannery in partnership with the Yurok that competed directly with Hume's. So the Yurok tribal members began getting into the cannery industry. And this industry is really important for Yurok fisher people as they are trying to get more economic development as subsistence fishing and subsistence living is dwindling. So these canneries are established in 1887, but by 1933, Indian gillnet fishing is banned on the Klamath River by the state of California, and commercial Klamath River fishery operations that were operating since about 1876 close. So this is a quote: during the years between the Indian commercial fishery closure in 1933 and the mid-1970s, conservation had indeed become a key word in relation to the Klamath. Conservation measures were obviously needed. Intense logging, construction of major dams, and burgeoning offshore and in-river fishing took their toll. Two natural disasters, the 1964 flood and the 1977 drought, added to the destruction. So this is something that I really want to note about settler industries or settler environmental management, that it was very clear as soon as, mining begins, that the state of California becomes very concerned with the fishing industry on the Klamath. So the three major runs of rivers that exist in the Pacific Northwest are the Sacramento, the Columbia, and the Klamath. So these are the three major fisheries runs that exist in this part of the country, and salmon fisheries runs. The Klamath was always kind of seen as this recreational paradise for settler fisher people. And so native commercial canning operations directly challenged that. So native people were very much a part of these early canneries industries as a way to subsist when subsistence fishing ended. So it's native people become a part of the industry that is directly being challenged by the state of California and recreational fisher people. And it's then banned in 1933. Okay. Can you still see? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can see your slides.
Awesome, thank you. So in 1933, so we're gonna go now to talk about some ethnographic photography. So in 1923, famed ethnographic photographer Edward S. Curtis took a picture of a Hupa fisherman traditionally gillnet fishing across a fish weir on the Trinity River in the Hupa Valley. This photograph, entitled Fish Weir Across the Trinity, depicts the Hupa fisherman in traditional Hupa clothing, a deerskin skirt, barefoot, long hair with no shirt on, his face hidden by the camera, blocked by his hair as he is looking down. So this was, again, taken in 1923, and this is a fish weir, a temporary fish dam. Another of Curtis's photographs, Hupa Trout Trap, depicts a Hupa fisherman, maybe the same person as above described, wearing the exact same outfit, this time bent over a trout trap in a fish weir, holding a sphere, his face hidden from the camera as well. The photographs depict Hupa people as Curtis wished to keep them, stuck in a bygone past and anonymous. While Curtis's photographs depict the fishermen on the fish weirs in traditional clothing, the Hupa and its neighboring tribes, the Yurok and Karuk, were still actively using and constructing fish weirs into the early 1940s. So I want to pause here. Even as environmental destruction was happening from 1850 onward, Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people are still building these temporary dams. And so these dams were built in ceremony. It would have begun with the first salmon ceremony during the different runs that occurred on the Klamath and its tributaries. And they would have been constructed via 10 days up. So 10 days for construction, 10 days for fishing, and then 10 days down. This was to allow other people to also get fish prior to them. Allow other tribes and fisher people to get fish and to not obstruct the river more than necessary. And so this kind of dichotomy is what I'm thinking about around temporary, indigenous critical infrastructure and settler critical infrastructure. Anne Spice, who wrote a really fantastic article around these kinds of issues of critical infrastructure, notes that much of settler infrastructure relies on the corporation, relies on economic development, relies on money, and relies on permanent obstruction. Whereas native critical infrastructure relies on being in relation to more than human relatives and those people who are also around you that depend on more than human relatives. So this indigenous critical infrastructure isn't permanent, because permanence would then obstruct the fisheries themselves. So I just wanted to put that in your head in how like these infrastructures differ. The reality of indigenous life on the basin in the early 1920s was decidedly different from what Curtis was depicting. This is noteworthy because of both the violent history of genocide in Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk territories, settler assimilationist tactics in the early 20th century, such as labor in the agricultural, timber, mining, and fisheries industries, and the little studied native activism against dam speculation in the lower Klamath Basin at the turn of the century. And so I'll get into what that means. So we're going to go back in time here. So this is another photograph, and it's entitled "Billy to My Rescue, a Salmon Dam," and is undated, but likely taken either in 1901 or 1902 by Nellie McGraw, a missionary who came to the Hupa Presbyterian Church to assimilate Hupa people. So there was a major assimilationist push at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. This photograph predates Curtis's stage portraits, and the depiction of the fish weirs is the most contemporary of the three, despite being taken about 20 years prior to Curtis's mentioned photographs. The subject, presumably Billy, is crossing a fish weir in decidedly more contemporary clothing than the two later subjects of Curtis's photos. Billy is crossing the fish weir in what looks to be a white button-down shirt with black suspenders, a bowler hat, and a dark pants. Billy's face is not visible to the viewer as the quality of film is poor, but he is half looking up and looking down as he's walking across the platform. The difference in this photograph is important to note. First, the subject, Billy, is given a name, and the title of the photograph, presumably given by McGraw, demonstrates a familiar and friendly relationship between the photographer and Billy. Billy's outfit is also important as it shows him as a contemporary Native man of circa 1901 and 1902, not a romanticized person in Native dress. The photograph is taken from McGraw's personal photograph album, different from Curtis's ethnographic gaze. While McGraw was sent to the Hupa Valley to sanitize the Hupa of their culture, that's a quote, the documentation by McGraw and her boss, Martha Chase, inadvertently helped to preserve Hupa culture. What is common across these photographs by McGraw and Curtis is the fish weir. Fish weirs were still being built into the early 20th century as Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people were grappling with the end of their world, as settlers were attempting to assimilate Native people in the valley. The importance of the fish weirs into the early 20th century through their very construction helps us understand the decolonial implications in their continuance during this period. So I want to pause here. The importance of these photographs rests in that the fish weirs are still being built despite this mass amount of violence that's occurring, despite settler critical infrastructure being built on the upper basin. Native people are still resisting by building these fish weirs. If you look at the boarding school, so Hupa Valley had its own boarding school. So if you look at some of the superintendent records, the superintendents often note that they could not stop Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people from practicing their traditions as much as they tried. So I think that really just speaks to this pushback against these settler critical infrastructures, even as their world was being destroyed. Construction of fish weirs continued even after the violent Northwest Indian Wars between 1850 and 1864 ended and resulted in Hupa and Yurok people forced onto reservations and the Karuks onto a small rancheria. The establishment of the military base Fort Gaston meant to quell attacks by Hupa, Willika, Cholula, Yurok, and Karuk people during the Indian Wars became the Hupa boarding school funded by the Federal Indian Service to assimilate Native children and adults of the region. United States agrarian-based assimilationist policies in the Federal Indian Service attempted to end Hupa and Yurok and Karuk culture. Hupa people, along with the surrounding tribal members of the Yurok and Karuk, entered economic labor that included carpentry, domestic and household labor, often employed through the Federal Indian Service, as well as commercial fishing, timber, and mining industries. As social historian Kathleen Cahill notes, by 1888, a quarter of Hupa men over 18 were working for the Indian Service. Cahill further argues that these strategies of engaging in economic industries within the Indian Service was a form of resistance to both sustain themselves as well as to safeguard their cultural practices. So I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. Many Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk people were working in these kind of settler industries. But I think one of the things that's really important about the cannery industry is that it's so closely related to who Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people are. So we're fisher people, have a deep relationship with these fish. And so to enter into that industry as a way of both connecting to those fish and then also attempting to have some level of economic stability after the end of the world is something quite noteworthy about Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people. As these photographs were taken in 1901 and 1923, the Klamath River and its tributaries were in a state of catastrophic change. Native people of the lower Klamath Basin were acutely aware of the construction of dams on both the upper and the proposed dams on the lower. Fisheries on the Klamath and its tributaries were severely affected by the construction of the upper basin, Klamath, the California, Oregon, and Power Company dams. The depletion of spawning fish was blamed on native fishing practices, such as the fish weir and the gillnet fishing, as well as canneries and commercial fishing operations that Yurok, Karuk, and Hupa people depended on. The upper Klamath Basin dams, built first as private irrigation ditches, then into large-scale irrigation and dam projects, began in 1868. These dam construction projects from private, local government, federal entities shaped both the upper and lower basin into the present day. However, the history of construction on the Klamath is necessary to understand the ecological and cultural impacts on tribes of both the upper and lower basin. Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people were engaged in the private and commercial fishing industries. These industries, according to May Nat, Yurok tribal member and president of the Yurok Indians Girls Club, noted in 1929 that 80% of the people engaged in the fishing industry are Indians who live along the river from the mouth to Martin's Ferry above about 50 miles. From 50 to 100% of the cash income of these Indians is derived from fishing and work in the cannery, while the middle-aged and older Indians have no other source of revenue, and no. So in the 1920s, the Electrometals Dam was proposed to provide hydropower for iron and aluminum smelting operations on the Humboldt Bay coastline, and it also was proposed to flood a large portion of Karuk and Yurok territories for recreational fishing, as the dam would create a large 19-mile lake. So there was a proposal by the Electrometals Corporation to build a plant around the sacred site of Ishipishi in Karuk territories, and that dam would flood out Karuk and Yurok territories and create an artificial lake. So there's some also newspaper opinions from different people about whether that's a good idea or not. It's kind of interesting to read. The artificial lake was offered as a solution to provide salmon and other fish species, such as trout, for the surrounding tribes and recreational fisher people. So it's like meant to kind of solve this native versus recreational fisher people problem that was happening on the basin. Tribal opposition to the dam, both because of cultural and economic reasons, was swift. Native activists from the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk tribes were quick to oppose the construction of the electrometal dam, and federal government attempts to move the boundaries of the Hupa Valley Reservation to construct the proposed dam project more easily. So the federal government attempts to move the boundaries of the Hupa Reservation that included Yurok lands to accommodate this dam. So it's like this combination between the federal government and private corporation. The dam proposal inspired Native activism in the 1920s to stop it, a long tradition that continues into the present. So I'm going to go back to the Curtis photographs. So 1923, Curtis comes in, is photographing this fish weir, painting Native people as being primitive in the past through the ethnographic gaze, setting Native people up to pose as traditional fisher people. But as he's doing that, the proposal of this dam is going through, and Native people are coming together to begin opposing it. So again, what Curtis is showing people is not the reality of what's happening on the Klamath. So in 1924, a protest with the Indians of Happy Camp, a Karuk tribal members, so Happy Camp is a Karuk town, or Karuk tribal members, was organized with the California Fish and Game Commission to protest the Ishipishi Dam, also known as the Electrometals Dam in Wairika, California. This celebration was meant to showcase Native dancing, games, religious festivities, and the brush dance, a dance to heal sick children. The 3-day cultural showcase highlight was the protest of the dam, with the Sacramento Bee reporting the Indians staged a protest against the proposed Ishipishi Power Dam as menacing their fish supply. The same year that the Karuk staged the protest at Wairika, the state of California passed the Klamath River Fish and Game District Initiative of 1924, or Proposition 11. This protected a portion of the Klamath River for conservation and recreational fishing purposes. The Klamath River was already severely affected by Upper California, Oregon, and Power Company dams, namely Copco 1 and Copco 2, and the need to conserve the river and its tributaries was already evident. Karuk tribal members were not the only Lower Klamath tribal members who were concerned with the conditions of fisheries on the Klamath or the potential for destruction by the electrometal dam. In 1929, the Yurok Indian Girls Club, organized by Yurok Youth Mini Spot, along with 50 other Yurok girls, with the guidance of Ruth Kellett Roberts, or Miss H.C. Roberts, in the San Francisco Bay Area of Piedmont, protested the electrometals dam directly to the U.S. and state governments. As Spot quoted in a June 1929 piece from the Oakland Post-Inquirer, quote, "Women's suffrage has been recognized among our people for more than 100 years. This is why we fight the battle for our rights," end quote. The Yurok Indians Girls Club protested the dam because they knew it would both end fishing on the Lower Klamath and that the U.S. government had overstepped in extending the boundaries of the Hupa Valley Reservation to include the proposed power sites. The area where the dams was proposed, they argued, was formerly a state and fish game preserve outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Interior, which oversees Indian reservation lands. Yurok tribal members, particularly from the Alice and Robert Spot family, participated in activism efforts to protect Yurok fishing rights at the mouth of the Klamath River. They often traveled to the San Francisco Bay Area, or were already based on the region and demonstrated by the Yurok Indian Girls Club to plead for better fisheries and economic conditions on the Klamath. In 1926, 3 years prior to the electrometal dam protest, Robert Spot and a group of Yurok dancers from Requa demonstrated ceremonial dances. One of the dance demonstrations had not been performed outside of the Requa area and needed special permission from Yurok leadership to do so. Likely it was a jump or white deerskin dance. The dance demonstrations were not altruistic or solely for educational purposes to non-natives. The Yurok delegation needed money due to the dire economic conditions on the Klamath in 1926, as fisheries were already affected by the upper Klamath dams by this time period. Yurok people depended on salmon runs on the Klamath to maintain both cultural and economic sustenance, as they worked both in traditional fishing as well as the canneries that were established at the mouth of the Klamath near Requa in 1887. So they're really trying to protect both this, the canneries industry and also subsistence fishing. So this is a really big effort by Yurok and Karuk fisher people during this time period. Oops. The Karuk and Yurok people worked with the State of California Fish and Game Commission, along with sport fishing groups to fight the construction of the Electrometals Dam. The Karuk feats or festivals and the Yurok protests in the San Francisco Bay brought much needed attention to the threat from privately owned and federally sanctioned water infrastructure projects to native life on the lower basin. Through all of this, Yurok, Hupa, Karuk people continued fishing and continued building fish weirs on the Klamath and its tributaries. The weirs shown in the Curtis and McGraw photographs would not have been built as mere props. They were built in ceremony and explicitly for the purpose of supplying salmon and trout to the people who still depended on them. Despite the government and private industry's best attempts, the tribes of the lower Klamath River Basin never gave up their cultural heritage. The state of California outlawed Indian fishing on the Klamath in 1933, placing much of the blame of fisheries depletion on Indian gillnet, commercial fishing, and canneries. So this is just a note, notwithstanding that there are many government reports prior to 1933 that recognize the effects of the upper basin dams on the Klamath and mining and timber industries. Recreational fisher people in the state of California, once allies of the lower basin tribes to protect the Klamath, became their enemies. This effectively ended public tribal fishing, so public in quotes, tribal fishing on the Klamath River, and forced Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk fisher people and their families to take fishing underground and under constant threat from federal and state wildlife enforcement officers. The loss of commercial fishing, canneries, and private fishing severely affected the cultural and economic development of tribal members of the lower basin. Despite the legal restrictions, Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk fishing families continued to both sell and practice traditional fishing until the Matts v. Arnett Supreme Court case in 1973 reversed the 1933 ban. And that's a whole, very interesting history as well. So I want to turn here to the actualized projects on the Klamath River and the proposed projects on the Klamath River. I just gave you a pretty detailed history of one of the proposed projects that actually was stopped by Native activism. So the Electrometals Dam never went through. But there were many other dam speculation schemes, some actualized and some not, on the Klamath itself. So proposed projects include Apa Dam. So Apa is the name of a Yurok village site. Kind of interesting that a lot of these dams, like Electrometals, was initially Ishipishi, which is a Karuk site, but Apa is a Yurok village site. So interesting that they would name these dams after significant cultural sites for Native people. So included Apa, Dos Rios, and sites. So if you know your California history right now, or you're following water news, you might recognize sites. This has been a project that has been proposed since at least the 1950s, probably even prior to that. So sites is a very old project proposed. So in the Central Coast region, Los Baños Grand Reservoir was proposed but never developed. And the state water project was to provide water to Southern California to deal with population growth. Original proposals were to transfer water to the north coast from Klamath, Eel, Mad, and Smith rivers. These were all proposed. Salmon runs were part of the main opposition to some of these proposals. Also, the Appa Dam would have flooded out Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk territories. So that's was a major consideration and a major part of Native activism around it. And then also Los Angeles actually wanted to focus, the city of Los Angeles wanted to focus their attention on the Colorado River. So if you follow news now, you know some of those effects of what is happening to the Colorado River and the multi-state issues around that waterway. But it's just important to note that even after electrometals, there were still proposed projects on the Klamath. And there's something like, I've counted, and I'm still going through government documents now, I've counted like at least 15 proposed projects on the Klamath. And other people have written about this. So Stephen Most wrote River of Renewal, and he talks a little bit about this. And Mark Reisner, who wrote Cadillac Desert, also talks a little bit about this. But the Klamath is one of the most significant waterways in the Pacific Northwest and California. And so there's always been these kind of schemes about how to manage this water source. So Kirsten Simmons argues in her article called Expanse, and hers is about Nevada military sites towards Paiute peoples. But she writes, our daily lives are structured around the projected expansion of these expanses of federal control of the settler state project, large-scale experimental military projects, so she's talking about the military in Nevada, that are multiplying or to function as a pristine state or national park. So talking about the development of national parks, state parks, engineered to be closer to a perceived state of nature as a technique of violent dispossession. So I argue too that settler water infrastructure and settler critical infrastructure is a technique of violent dispossession, and Marxist kind of forgetting of indigenous sovereignty and nationhood that continues the violence of dispossession. So Native people have been dispossessed by these infrastructure projects. But even as that has been happening, and I focus on Northwest California, there's always been a resistance to that. I think there tends to be a narrative, especially around the Klamath, that it was, 2002 was really the start of this major activism movement. But really, Native people of the Klamath, the Hupa, Yurok, and of the lower Klamath, the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk, have been organizing around the protection of their rivers since the inception of settler colonial violence. So settler critical infrastructure becomes a form of violence against Native people when our water is taken, when those relationships between salmon is ended through these state laws and propositions that banned Indian gillnet fishing on the Klamath. And if you know anything about history of the Klamath, you know of the 1978 Klamath Salmon Wars, which was a majorly violent event against Yurok fisher people, where U.S. and California wildlife enforcement officers came in and brutalized Yurok fisher people. So this is a history that's not that far away in the past. So I just want to show you the Actualized projects. So the Bureau of Reclamation's the Central Valley Project. So the federal Central Valley Project is primarily for irrigation purposes for agricultural water users in the Central Valley. Water from the Trinity River Diversion Project feeds into the Central Valley. So remember at the beginning when I look at the Sacramento, I always think that's the Trinity River. It's because the water from the Trinity River, my home river, is being diverted into the Sacramento River via the Trinity River Diversion Project, which was built in 1964. And that diversion affects Trinity River salmon runs to this day. So we always have issues around salmon runs on the Trinity because of this project. And then this is the map of the proposed Apaw Dam. So it was proposed in 1950 as a part of the Western Water Reconnaissance Report commissioned by the Bureau of Reclamation. Project is named Apaw after Yurok village, which would have flooded the tribal lands of Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples. So this is what it would look like. So from this report, the requirement for the study develops fundamentally from a full recognition of the unequal distribution of vital water source in the Western states and the vast and increasing influx of population into those states with little regard to water supplies available to sustain such populations and their resulting economies and civilizations. In view of the known huge surplus of water wasting into the sea to the north. So that's a common refrain you'll see a lot, water wasted into the sea. And the existing and potential shortage in the Southwest, those inevitable instructions were given to look into the future possibilities of transporting surplus waters to satisfy the Northwest deficiencies. The report here, what's submitted, is not complete in its coverage of all possibilities. It is presented at this time in order to make available information thus far evaluated. So the Apaw Dam was one of several dozen proposed dams and reservoirs on the Klamath River and other major Northern California rivers. And it fails to mention any of the tribal lands that would be flooded. So also, if you know a bit about the history of dams in the United States, you also know that many reservation lands have been flooded out by major dams projects. One of the most famous being the Pick-Sloan Plan in the Missouri River Basin. So there's a book called Damned Indians that's all about that history. And so these aren't like, these weren't proposals that were unique to the Klamath, but actually represents, as Dr. William Bauer has noted in an article about Dos Rios Dam, represents this period of Indian removal through this flooding of water, flooding of native sites and reservations. So it would have been a huge project, but it's abandoned in favor of Colorado River diversions to the south. And then this is what the actualized Klamath River ended up looking like. Obviously, it doesn't have the Trinity Diversion Project here, but the upper basin experiences the end of salmon runs to the upper Klamath Lake with the construction of the Link River Dam, but really ends and doesn't go into Oregon and with the construction of Iron Gate Dam in 1963. And so this is what those dams look like on the Klamath, though it's an old map because there are 4 less dams on here. Dam speculation ends on the Klamath with the passage of the California Wild and Scenic River Act of 1972. So California's this California Act prohibits the construction of dams and infrastructure except for local uses on the following rivers. And you'll see that the Klamath and the Trinity are 2 of the major ones. While the Wild and Scenic River Act officially ends dam speculation, so it ends like this kind of speculation around whether dams can be built on this river and what that might look like. It does not remove projects already in place. So the projects that are already in place remain, so they stay. So at the time of this reading of this, at the time of this talk, 4 dams on the Klamath have fallen. Tribal fish weirs have not been constructed on the Klamath and its tributaries since the 1940s. So all of my sources that I've looked through, and maybe other people might have other sources, that the last fish weir on the Trinity was in 1940. So construction crews have removed all 4 of these dams, the Copco 1, Copco 2, Iron Gate, and J.C. Boyle on the Klamath. So those are done. This event, the deconstruction of 4 dams on the upper Klamath River, marks generations of indigenous activism on the Klamath waters, namely from the Klamath tribes, the Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk tribal members, mirroring much of the early activism against Electromeadows Dam in the 1920s. The decommissioning of these initial 2 dams raised concerns from various entities on the basin about, whether the river really could come back from that. What would happen to small communities that depended on the artificial Copco Lake for recreation? Concern around flooded out areas. But what we have seen is actually that they're coming back. The salmon and the other fishery species are coming back and have come back in a way that is quite remarkable. So the dams were removed in August. The last one came down in August, and then in October, the first salmon have been sighted past the Oregon border in like 60 to 112 years were the first time that those salmon were seen up. So rivers have a way of being able to restore themselves. And as many people from Yurok leadership and Karuk leadership and people who are studying the fisheries from the tribal end have noted, it'll take many years to get to the full restoration, but it's already happening, and it's happening pretty quickly. Native people were blamed for the depletion of these fisheries almost as soon as colonization began. Native people were blamed for our fishing practices. But it has been Native-led activism that has removed these dams and has restored this river and will continue to restore this river as new generations are coming. The dams of the upper Klamath Basin, not to mention the dams of the lower Trinity River that feeds the largest tributary, the Klamath, that feeds the agricultural center of the state of California, wreaked havoc on the fisheries of the Klamath River for over 100 years. The removal of these dams signifies the potential to restore the first salmon ceremony. So the ceremony that builds these fish weirs and the fish weirs themselves through a new decolonial vision for the Klamath River and its tributaries. So I want to end on that. So this is kind of an interesting photo to end on because it's Edward Curtis. But this person, whoever he may have been, was likely, still fishing in the way that his ancestors had fished since time immemorial, but was likely wearing, pants and like a button-down shirt or, whatever he was wearing in the 1920s. But fish weirs have a potential to restore some of that relationship, the cultural and physical relationship that Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people have to the Klamath and its tributaries itself. I imagine that they would be done in much of the same way as has been documented by early anthropologists who documented the first salmon ceremonies. So 10 days up, 10 days down, and 10 days to 10 days up, 10 days to fish, and then 10 days down. And there have already been, I know that the Karuk tribe has had discussions about this potential that actually Stephen Most in River Renewal documents a fish weir being built in Yurok territories in 2001. And in 2015, Hupa Fisheries also built a weir to see how it might impact salmon and trout runs. So these are things that Native people are doing on the basin and are considering on the basin. And I think it represents this kind of decolonial future where our rivers are healthy again. There's still challenges through settler critical infrastructure, namely through the dams that are still in place on the upper basin, the Trinity Diversion Project, and the potential for the site's reservoir. So those projects all pose a threat to the restoration of fisheries on the Klamath and its tributaries. But I have a lot of hope for the future that we will see fish weirs come back again in ceremony. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orona, for that great talk. We do have a few questions that have rolled in, so I'll start with the first. Was mostly a Northern California struggle, or were North American-wide or international solidarity movements a help in bringing down the dams? And this person said, I'm thinking along the lines of struggles against DAPL and how big that was.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question really fast?
Sure. This attendee asks, was the fight against these dams mostly a northern struggle, or were North American-wide or international solidarity movements a help in bringing down the dams? And they're thinking of things like DAPL.
So there was a lot of solidarity movements, actually. If you ever seen the film Gather, which came out in 2019, so Sammy Jensal, who's a Yurok fisherman, he worked with, I know he's worked with international folks through his organization Ancestral Guard. So doing like work in Brazil where they have major dam projects as well. He mentions another place that he went to, but I forget where it was at. But they've traveled around the world to do like solidarity with indigenous people around these kinds of infrastructure projects. Dams are a major impediment for indigenous people, not just in the United States and Northern California, but in almost every river system has like this type of story around the fight to protect these places. So like the Snake River is one as well that has major historical major like protest and activism around it. Also the Columbia, of course, is a very famous river system that has had a Supreme Court case around it, the Bolt decision, which affirms treaty rights in that area. The thing I will say that's unique about California is that we don't have these kind of reserved treaty rights that we can point to on the Klamath. But and I don't get too much into it in the talk, but what really helps protect the Klamath is the development of the reservation by executive order and the determinant that the river is a part of the reservation. So in 1973, the Yuroks then get guaranteed fishing rights. And then 1994, they get affirmed 50% of any catch on the Klamath. Sorry, that's just going more deeply into some of this history, but there is a lot of international solidarity movements that have happened on the Klamath. And I know that there's been youth groups that have gone back and forth between the Amazon and the Klamath as well.
Thank you. Our next question. So our attendee asks, where could we go to learn more about Yurok, Karuk, and Hupa cultures? And secondly, they ask, where did you find a lot of the resources for your research, or what kinds of sources were you using?
Yeah, so there's there's the tribal websites, the Yurok, Hupa, Karuk websites that'll have information about some of the stuff that I'm talking about. Dr. Kutcher Baldi has written a really fantastic book called We Are Dancing for You, which is about women's coming of age ceremonies. There's some rare books like Our Home Forever by Byron Nelson, who talks about Hupa history. So it's the Hupa official history. It was written in the 1970s. Who else? We Are the Land by William Bauer, which I think California State Library hosted a talk from him. He has some information on the Hupa. We're actually a very well-documented tribe. Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people, or tribes, we're actually pretty well documented by anthropologists. But I like to point to the native sources, the people who are writing native people who are writing our own histories. So Jack Norton wrote a book about the genocide in Northwestern California called When Our Worlds Cried, Genocide in Northwestern California, which is a rare book, but a good one, and one that I recommend around the topic of violence in this area. My book will be coming out in a few years, hopefully, about this topic. But there are many sources to learn a little bit about Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people. Actually, Tending the Wild also has some information about the fish wars as well, the 1978 fish wars, which is really informative. Oh, and sorry, Lucy Thompson wrote a book. She was a Yurok medicine woman who wrote at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century her own autobiography. It's called To the American Indian, and that's really good. So I really like to point to the native-based sources that we're telling our own histories. And as far as my own sources for this, I went through many newspapers, trying to find information around the Electrometals Dam. And I want to thank, I don't think she's on this, but I always like to thank her, Dr. Kat Whiteley, who pointed me to that dam as a potential research source. So that was good. And then really state archives, I went through their fish and game sources, UC Davis, the David Risling collection, some of the BIA collections, and then the Kroeber archives too. I mean, there's a lot you could critique about Alfred Kroeber, obviously, in his ethnographic, the way that he wrote about us, but it's also helpful to read what some of his informants were saying. My great-great-grandmother was an informant of Kroeber, so it's kind of interesting to read her own, discussions with him and stuff, and to get some of that family history.
Thank you so much. Our next question is again about your research, and they would like to know, is any of your research used in government policymaking, given that it might be helpful for a dam project?
I don't think so. I mean, the thing is that most of these documents are also older. So these dam projects were already proposed and then kind of like shuffled away, especially as the Wild and Scenic River Act kind of ends a lot of the speculation. So there's no more proposed dams on the Klamath, but the Sites Reservoir, which I mentioned, is proposed on the Sacramento. So there's a lot of discussion around how it's going to impact the Trinity, because the Trinity already gives up a lot of water to the Sacramento River. So if anybody from government institutions come to my talk, they maybe see how I critique that, because that's an old project. It is often touted as this kind of new thing, but it's actually a pretty old project from the 1930s that's been kind of uplifted again. So there are many organizations like Save California Salmon that makes comments around projects like that. And I think my major job is just pointing out how what's new is not that new, like that water infrastructure project is actually not a new thought. It's like something that came from a different time period.
Thank you. Our next question. So you mentioned at the outset the reservations were created through executive order. I was hoping you could elaborate on that executive order and how, if it does, break from the treaty process the U.S. has used with other Native nations prior to 1850.
Yeah, so this is a longer history in California, actually, as it relates to the treaty process. So and I might be getting the dates a little bit wrong on the treaties off the top of my head, but treaties were being negotiated in 1850 to 1852 up and down the state of California. And remember, this is at like the height of what is known as the California Indian Genocide. So when militias and militaries were going into Native sites and Native communities and annihilating Native people, taking them to be indentured servants, and it's codified in California state law. So that's like not even argued over. That's what was happening. So in 1850 and 1852, there are these negotiations that are happening up and down California. So treaties are negotiated, and they're negotiated on the Klamath. But what ends up happening is that a delegation from the California State Legislature, as they're going to be ratified in Congress, says, well, you're giving up too much land to these tribes. And so we actually don't want these treaties to be ratified. And remember, this is a period of intensive violence. So it's like a horrific time for Native people. And so the treaties don't get ratified and they become known as the lost treaties or the secret treaties of California. And Kat Whiteley, again, is writing a really fantastic book around some of this history on treaties in California. But what ends up happening is that in 1864, on the Klamath in Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk territories, Native people are fighting back. So there's a lot of resistance against these kind of military campaigns going into these territories. And Native people are like burning down ranches, are attacking miners who are attacking Native people, are like really just doing a lot to resist settler encroachment into their areas. And so what happens is that the United States just basically says, let them have this land. Let them just, the idea was that they wanted to move Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people to Round Valley potentially, which is where weren't a lot of Native people were removed in Northern California. But they just say, just let them have this land, let them have this valley, let them have that strip of the former Klamath River Reservation. So 1864, the Hupa Valley Reservation is established, and then in 1891, the Yurok Strip is put onto it. So there's a lot of that is due to these resistance efforts from the tribes and not leaving and not giving up their home space. So the executive order is pushed in, and then that's what creates the reservation. And there are 4 reservations that are created across California, but Hupa and what becomes the Yurok Strip is the largest. Sorry, I know there's a lot of information.
Yeah, thank you so much for this context. Our next question. So our attendee says, I was surprised that the phrase dumping water into the ocean has been around since 1950. In response to drought, I often hear people say, just build more dams, and why is California wasting all that water? How might one respond to comments like these from a decolonial informed viewpoint?
That's a good question. So I'm going to say that that narrative has been around since at least 1880 in these policy documents. So it's a long time. And as it's almost as soon, I keep saying almost as soon, it's as soon as colonial settlers are coming into the area, right? They're seeing how to make different riverways useful for their industry. So whether that be mining or agriculture or timber or whatever, or canneries, though canneries are not as essential to the state or US government, but they're really looking at how to make these things useful for human consumption. I think what I would say is that California has always been kind of, since I've been alive, and for a long time, I think it's been built up as like this agricultural state. Like we've always been this agricultural state. We've always done this. We've always been this like economic state. Agriculture has only been really a major industry since the 1960s. And it's really after the period of dam construction that happens in the 50s and early 60s, both to deal with flood control, some hydroelectric, not that much, but mainly agriculture. And so these narratives are kind of made up narratives. They're not actually based in like the reality of how like important agriculture is to the economy. It's like not really that big of a moneymaker for the state itself. I think it's touted as that. It's often touted as California feeds the world. These are often like bougie crops like almonds, alfalfa, feeding for ranches, stuff like that, beef. So it's not like you can really critique the corporate agricultural industry And also recognize kind of this propaganda that goes on around it. State of California is heavily dammed too, heavily dammed, heavily infrastructured. So, and it hasn't really solved our water problems. Like it really hasn't. And many of the reservoirs that were built to contain floods, like Folsom Lake or Shasta Dam, Folsom Dam, Shasta Dam, which are like capture, water capture sites. You can't really capture something that's not there. When there's a drought, you're not going to get more water because you have more dams, really. So that's kind of how I think about it, at least, or what I tell people. It's like, well, you can build more dams, but they're just going to create more ecological problems on these rivers that already have ecological problems around salmon fisheries. So it's this idea that we can build our way out of these problems, which is actually not true. And it's one of those things around Sites Reservoir that's being touted as well. It's like, well, this will like create another capture site. It's like, well, there's not water really here at all. And what is already existent isn't captured. And also that these settler infrastructure projects aren't maintained necessarily. So how do you maintain a dam? Like, they actually need to be maintained to also work. I mean, I'm not like, so these are just things to consider and think about. And Sacramento Valley isn't a floodplain. So obviously there are like needs in the Central Valley too. It's like a huge floodplain. Essentially, there was a major lake called Tule Lake that existed in the valley that is not there anymore because all the rivers used to flow to it and now it doesn't. So like we're changing the landscape and it's still not solving the problems.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question. So are more dams planned for removal both on the Klamath and other rivers in California? Could the Trinity Diversion Project be reconsidered?
I don't know on the Klamath if there's more plans. I don't think so right now. I imagine that there are some of the dams that are existent now on the Klamath are the ones that are a part of the irrigation projects, which are more sticky because they're tied to agricultural economics. So like people who are farmers and depend on agriculture for their living. So that's a harder thing to, there's a lot of dissension amongst Native people and fisher people. Native people and agriculture. Like that's kind of a thing that has historically existed, as well as like recreational fisher people as well. So it's just kind of interesting when alliances happen, when like these historic enemies, quote unquote. The Trinity Diversion Project makes a lot of money for agriculture. And so a lot of that water is diverted down through the Westlands Water District to support agricultural projects. To me, those are the next big fights. And those are, I think, a little bit harder because the hydroelectric dams were obsolete, and the Warren Buffett's Pacific Corp agreed that they were obsolete. What they would have had to have done is built fish ladders, but they decided that actually it would cost less to just take the dams down than to build fish ladders on these dams. So this is kind of where the corporation comes in their they're the ones that decided to remove the dams based on Native activism, but a lot of it, it kind of shows you the power of a corporation as well to decide whether to remove those impediments or not. So I think those are like the next big battles. I think there are some, like the Eel River, there's a PG&E dam on the Eel that's subject to removal. That's an obsolete dam. So I think one of the big things that's going to happen is that there's going to be more attention to obsolete infrastructure that doesn't offer either hydroelectricity or are not maintained. So I think those are the next big removals that'll happen.
Thank you. And I think we'll just have time for this one last question. So one attendee asks, has the dam removal effort facilitated the beginning of improved relationship between Native communities living near the river and other local non-Native residents?
I don't know. I think so. It's a long history of violence that happened here in Northwestern California. And I do think that I don't want to end like on like a sour note either, but like the 4 dam removals was a coming together of many different interests that had not aligned ever. If you listen, my talk, I'm sorry, you listen to my talk. There was a lot of like dissension between recreational fisher people and then non-native recreational fisher people and then fisher people and then native fisher people and then the state of California aligns with the tribes and then they don't align with the tribe, like there's all of this thing, these ebbs and flows that happen in this area that really has this very long and bleak history of violence against Native people. And like I said, in the 1970s, US government and state government officials were coming in to brutally enforce fishing bans. People were beaten, were arrested. There are reports of people being like almost drowned, Yurok fisher people being almost drowned by enforcement officers. So I think that takes longer to kind of contend with. And I'm just a researcher, right? Like I am Hupa, but I'm only researching what I see and how I'm reading the records. And that feeling might be very different for other people on the Klamath. But I think it's always there is a level of anti-Indigenous violence that happens in that area, unfortunately. And I'd like to think it's getting better, but I think that there will always be some of this dissension too.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for a wonderful presentation and for taking the time to answer these questions.